look at the PowerPoint. Okay, so well, first of course I would like to thank the organizers, especially our hosts, Miguel Sanceta, and of course thanks Sylvia for inviting me. I'll begin my presentation the same way Professor Wolf begins his book. There's a phone call from a certain government agency asking you to participate in a team creating a new public policy. It can be on gambling, on the treatment of animals, on health reform, on railway security, take your pick. And after a long deliberation, let's say about 30 seconds, you say yes. But then the moment of reflection kicks in. What can a political philosopher actually contribute to the process of creating a public policy? What can philosophers offer that economists, sociologists, political scientists, legal scholars, and experts in that specific field can? The obvious answer is that we have a better mastery of abstract concepts, ideas, and arguments employed in policy decision processes. But what does that actually mean? And how can we translate this mastery into something useful to policy? In the next 35 minutes, 30 minutes, so I'm hoping to leave as much time for discussion as possible. I'll try to answer these questions, or to be more precise, as the title suggests, I'll give 6 different ways we can answer this question. And each of these answers will correspond to a model of a political philosopher involved in discussing public policy issues. So to make things a bit more coherent, for each of these models, I'll look at which is the specific goal, specific mission that the political philosopher is trying to achieve. What are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? So basically the presentation is expanding on the main question, on the question that Jonathan's book ends with. I won't offer any profound philosophical arguments or deep insights. It's more of a starting point. I'm hoping for an interesting discussion. Okay, so let me begin. I mean, the PowerPoint presentation is just supposed to sort of list the models here so you can follow it more easily, but it's only 6, so I promise I won't go to the 7th one, so I think you can without the presentation, you can follow it. So okay, the first one I call the Syracuse model. Now the Syracuse model answers to the question posed above. What is the philosopher's role in policy-making process? In the following way. It says it's bringing the true, the rational argument to the table. The political philosopher who embraces this model is on an argument mission. He wants public policies to be directed by a philosophical principle or set of principles. Think of Kant's treating people as ends, never as means, or Bentham's greatest happiness, or the greatest number, or Mill's hard principle. And he doesn't want policy to be open to political bargaining, populist tendencies, or incoherent conditions. Syracusean philosopher is a true philosopher king and brings the light of rational and philosophical coherent principles to the dirty business of policy. Now, the advantage of this model of political philosopher is that when it comes to deciding policy issue, he should be, at least in his or her own view, the main guy or gal in the room. Any revision or radical change in existing policy will have to begin by taking into account the abstract principle or set of principles that the philosopher puts forward. It's a top-down process of policy decision-making. We can't avoid looking at the concepts and principles that are on the very top, and therefore we can't avoid giving the philosopher a central role. A disadvantage is that this model seems to work only if we take top-down approach. As Wolf points out in his book, we should be skeptical about this type of approach. Applying general philosophical principles to policy issues can often backfire, and we've already talked about this now in the discussion, the first part. Well, either because we're trying to make facts fit our theories, or because we're refusing to see the full consequences of applying abstract theories to real-life challenges. On top of that, it seems that this model rests on 2 premises that most political philosophers would reject today. One is that there are objective principles that work as knockdown arguments when applied to policy issues. And the second one is that we can convincingly show that there is only one or a single theoretical principle or set of principles that is superior to all the others. The second model I want to discuss is I call the Rawlsian model. So this model of political philosopher is both epistemologically and ethically less ambitious, more modest than the previous model. It's also more realistic. First, Rawlsian doesn't seek to affirm the truth with a big T, or proclaim sub specia aeternatis, what objective principle certain policy has to embody to be considered justifiable. But it relies on underlying core values and concepts that are embedded in the moral and political tradition of a specific community, such as particular understanding of equality or liberty. Second, this model allows much more flexibility than the previous model in the sense that it doesn't strive to impose one particular principle or set of principles on the issue that is being debated, but rather tries to exclude certain arguments from the policy debate by declaring them unreasonable or irrational. And as the name suggests, this model is basically what you get if you apply the philosophy of later rules policy-making process. Now, the advantage of this model is that unlike the Syracuse model, this model can accommodate more than just one option and even can strive to reach a compromise between these different options. Also, it doesn't necessarily rest on top-down approach, but it can more easily incorporate empirical insights without interpreting them so that they are compatible with abstract philosophical principles. Now, this advantage of this model is that this model inevitably has to establish a certain standard. In case of Rawls and his followers, this is reasonableness, which allows it to exclude certain options and certain types of arguments invoked to justify these options. The fact that advocates of this model often disagree what the standard should actually be, just take Rawls's and then Gauss's and Jonathan Kwong's understanding of what is reasonable, or how we should understand this concept, suggests that the decision which options are in and which options are out is going to seem rather arbitrary. So the third model is a value pluralist model. And the guiding light for this model is one of the last sentences of Berlin's famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty. Actually, not Berlin's own, but taken from Schumpeter. To realize the relative validity of one's conviction and yet stand for them unflinchingly is what distinguishes a civilized man from a barbarian. So unlike the Rawlsian model, its goal is not to exclude certain positions and arguments from the debate, but to take them all into account and then advocate one of them, while pointing out that every case, even the one that pluralists at the end advocates, entails that something of value will be lost. This is what Berlin called the tragic choice. Now, value pluralist's mission is threefold. He wants to give the best philosophical defense for different options being discussed. He wants to show that there is no one superior principle that can make our decision easier, and that different options are basically incommensurable. And he wants to give a solid argument at the end for one option, while pointing out what is going to be lost if we accept his suggestion. Now, the advantage of this approach is that it allows different options to be discussed without eliminating any of them a priori, or giving them all moral weight, or most of them, because some options are just ridiculous or deeply moral or irrational. So that even if one option has to be taken, and thus in the policy-making process, even if you take the decision not to change anything, other options are not just swept under the rug. And they had their disadvantages of this approach is that the main disadvantage of this model arises from criticism that was often directed towards Isaiah Berlin, sometimes by his own powers. If different options are incommensurable, then on what grounds do we choose one option over the others? How can the advocate of this model say, well, this is the option we should choose because of this and this business? Okay, so pluralist model is the fourth model I'm going to discuss. Proceduralist model. This model is very similar to the value pluralist model in that it also accepts that there is no one best way to deal with a policy dilemma and that we might not be able to rank different points of view on some predetermined scale. One important difference from the Berlin-inspired model is that it doesn't strive to find what he thinks is either the best or the least painful option. Its goal is only to give different options a chance to be heard. Its main motto, following Stuart Hampshire, is alle alternative. So one could ask, why do we need a political philosopher to do that? In democratic societies where free speech is guaranteed, isn't it better to allow different interests or social groups to voice their own concerns about a certain policy? Well, that might as well be true, but there are at least two cases where the presence of proceduralists and policy-making bodies can prove useful. Well, first, the group whose interest might be endangered is not mobilized enough to let its voice be heard. And secondly, when power relations between different parties are so skewed on one side that the voices of those on the other side are completely muffled. Example from Paul's book on this is when he's warning us his warning when he's discussing the issue of disability, and I'll quote here. Just as we might pay attention to examples of people with disabilities, we must also not allow the debate to become completely dominated by those with the greatest public presence or sympathy or strongest lobbying group. So in short, proceduralists, when faced with this two types of cases, can act as a mouthpiece for powerless or can make the playing field more even. Now the advantage of this model is that it has the same advantages as the value pluralist model, without having to explain why we choose one option over other measurable options, because it's basically not suggesting an option, it's just trying to allow different options to be heard. But this is also his biggest weakness. In policy-making process, we do have to make a decision in the end, even if that decision is to stick to status quo. So proceduralist doesn't have an answer to the question, which policy should we choose at the end? Fifth model is, I call it the Wizard of Oz model. Now in a famous scene in Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's dog Toto pulls the curtain and reveals that the wizard in question is a mere con man. In this model, the political philosopher basically takes the role of Toto. So he sees his mission not in promoting certain principles or making sure that all sides have their say, but in pulling the curtain on concepts, principles, and arguments invoked in public policy debates and revealing them in proof. It's a mission of avoiding what Wolff calls in his book the dangers of hidden assumptions. One example of applying these models is when Wolff talks about Turing's theory in the chapter on crime and punishment, and revealing the underlying logic behind it. It rests on an economic, basically, cost-benefit model of human behavior, which might or might not be the best way to understand individual motivation. It's worth noting that this model works as a two-way road. By revealing what's behind the curtain, the philosopher finds out how and if different theories and arguments, when applied to public policy realm, work or not. After all, Oz, as we remember, was a con man, but he also helped Lion find his courage, Tin Man his heart, and Scarecrow his brain. I can't think of a better illustration of this than Wolff's book, in which every chapter ends with a short lesson for philosophy section. So for example, in a chapter on scientific experiment on animals, Wolff convincingly shows that the dominant philosophical thinking on this topic, treating animals as either having full weight or not, or we shouldn't allow ascribe it no more, we shouldn't ascribe it any more concern, that this type of black and white position is actually misguided. The advantage of this model is that it gives philosophers role where they can really shine. Putting doubt in presumptions that are considered common sense or intuitively true has always been philosophers' strong suit. Economists, sociologists, and political scientists might be and are probably much better at collating and crunching the data, but philosophers are usually better at giving us a broader picture that goes beyond sheer data. Now, the disadvantage of this model is that revealing the hidden assumptions behind certain policy solutions might not be the most popular, or for that matter, the most effective way in tackling policy challenges. So the philosopher that advocates the Wizard of Oz model might not be most welcome to contribute to policy proposals. Also, policymakers might not be too interested. The philosopher involved in policy-making process has new insight for his fellow academics. After all, they're interested in policy, not philosophy. And the last model is, I call it the bullshit model. Now, the bullshit model takes one step further from Wizard of Oz model. If there are no knockdown arguments, no great truths to be realized through public policies, if all concepts are inherently contested, then it might make sense for a political philosopher involved in public policy-making process to behave as a modern-day sophist. If we start receiving all the sides in some public policy debate as nothing more than different elements in the same power game, nothing stops us from becoming a gun for hire, philosopher for hire, offering our philosophical expertise to the highest bidder. Knowing that every side in the argument can be shown to be true or untrue, right or wrong, just or unjust, reasonable or unreasonable, consistent or inconsistent, all that remains is a power game. Hence the name bullshit model. Not caring if we are arguing for what we are arguing is true or not is, as Harry Frankfurt points out, the essence of bullshit. Advantage from this model is, well, the advantage is mainly personal. Policymakers will probably be thrilled to hire a philosopher who is ready to defend with philosophical arguments their preferred position and discredit the position of their political opponents. Therefore, the political philosopher who embraces the bullshit model can expect many phone calls from the government. Disadvantage, of course, is that it's questionable if advocates of this model should call themselves philosophers at all. Sure, they have the whole intellectual arsenal at their disposal, but as Plato pointed out in Gorgias, it's the goal we are striving for, and not the tools of the trade that makes the good philosopher. There is a reason why sophists have such a background. And in conclusion, I want to say a few words on the relationship to these 6 different models. The fact that I referenced Jonathan's Wolff's book in describing some of these models suggests that most of them are not mutually excludable. They work, these models, as I went through them, as sort of ideal models. So it's fair to assume that the philosopher involved in making public policy recommendations will take more than just one of these models into account. After all, that is exactly what Wolff is doing in his own book. However, it's worth noting that our understanding of how these models relate to each other will in large part depend on which model we find to be most convincing. For those philosophers, let's say Leo Strauss, who embrace the Syracuse model, the rest of the models I've described will tell a tale of decline. Each next model is losing a bit more of what the true philosopher's calling should be from its side, reaching the very bottom in the bullshit sophist model. From the perspective of those that describe the bullshit model, the story is just the opposite. It's a narrative of philosophers' hubris culminating with a smug Syracuse model. For the other 4 models, all of which show their face in Wolff's book, the story is one of avoiding the extremes. We should avoid boarding the ship to Syracuse, but also keep away from becoming philosophers for hire in the bullshit line. And the book Ethics and Public Policy is a very good guide on how to do this. Thank you very much.